Hi, everybody. Listen, I'm so glad you're here with me. Tonight, I've got a really special guest, the most amazing New York Times best-selling author, Michael Gross, who pretty much wrote the Bible on the modeling industry. It's called Models. Put up the book, Michael. Model the ugly business of being beautiful. Now, he's also written a bunch of other books about 745 Park, and he's got an insane book coming out that we will talk about at the end of this. It's called Treasured Island. It's about St. Bart's. So, Michael is basically a chronicler of the beautiful and the wealthy. He knows all these things. He was there just as I was during the Epstein heyday. And, some of these things that we think are not going on anymore certainly are. But I wanted to talk to Michael because after reading through just some of the Epstein files, let's be clear, it's gazillions of pages, and my eyes were crossing, not just with fury, but exhaustion after reading it. And in the Epstein files, it was clear that multiple young models were among his victims in the sex trafficking ring. He also, his biggest financier was Les Wexner, who ran and owned Victoria's Secret. And they had a bizarre relationship where Les gave him hundreds of millions for, I don't know why. But Jeffrey Epstein would use that as an entree to audition models. Now, there are some tapes of this in the actual files of models like turning around and auditioning and all that. But Epstein also had very close ties to heads of modeling agencies. Now, Michael, it's so frustrating and it's hard for me to really wrap my head around this. But a lot of times it seems like modeling agencies, even some of the bigger ones back in the day, just kind of seemed as a front or a pipeline to perverts and pedophiles. What's that about?
Well, at the very beginning, modeling agencies were started by ex-models, and they were professional talent agencies.
Mm-hmm.
But within about 45 seconds, guys came along who realized, whoa, these could be date farms. I can grow my own dates for myself and for my friends. And as early as the 1930s, there was a guy named Harry Conover, who was a serial model dater. Am I allowed to curse on your show?
You are allowed to curse, but let's move it a little forward. We get that this has kind of
But
happened.
you have to understand,
let's not go
Harry
back to
Conover,
the dawn of time.
Harry Conover was a model for model agents who came later. And cut to the 1960s, late 60s, and along comes Johnny Casablancas, who invented something called elite models and changed the entire modeling industry, because what he did was he didn't market them as girls in twin sets and pearls who were very demure blondes who you couldn't imagine going to the bathroom, let alone having sex. He marketed them down on all fours, half-dressed. And that infuriated his number one competitor, who was a woman named Eileen Ford, whose husband and son both had it off with models all the time, but she portrayed herself as the moral paragon. And Johnny Casablancas portrayed himself as a real guy. It didn't hurt that he had a European accent. He went to school in Switzerland. He was a rich Spaniard. He knew his way around a woman. He knew his way around the nightclub. And Johnny became the model for the whole next generation of modeling agents. He surrounded himself with a bunch of photographers who became known as the French mob, whose motto, one of them said to me, was, no, 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 you don't fall in love. You skewer as many of them as you can.
Whoa, you don't fall in love, you skewer them as many
of them
as many as you can. Wow. And Casablancas was very active in the 90s and I believe the early 2000s, correct?
Well, how do you mean active?
Well, the modeling agency was active, elite.
And John himself was very active as well, and was known in the industry and subsequently outside of it, thanks in part to my book Model, as someone who wasn't averse to having intimate relations with underage women. But the thing was that think of Johnny as Mick Jagger. No girl has ever complained about having sex with Mick Jagger. Even if
Mm,
that girl was, I can see you're just 13 years old. No, I don't want your ID. Johnny
mm,
was the Mick Jagger of the modeling industry. No women until much, much later complained about him.
right.
Um,
But
the
could they? Because if they wanted a job, they couldn't complain. And this was the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. If you said something, there went your money.
Well, this is true, but that kind of blackmail wasn't necessary all the time because
Mm-hmm.
every single day there was a new bus coming from Podunk with more 16-year-olds on it. So, one said no, you move on to the next one. And John was not the kind of guy who would just tie up and rape a girl. He was
Right.
he was he was suaver than that. The girls fell in love with him. But the
Well,
next generation of agents who came along in the 80s, they played it very, very differently. And they're in many ways the villains of the book that I wrote because they would drug girls. They would get girls addicted to drugs. They would make it clear that you do what you do with me or you don't work. That
right.
began to happen with this rougher group of guys who ran agencies, particularly in Milan and in Paris, but
Mm.
also in New York.
Well, let's stay on John Casablancas for a minute because the model Jill Dodd did actually accuse him of sexual assault, and he had a was married or no a relationship with Stephanie Seymour. Let's talk about that because this is mind blowing to me. What happened with him and Stephanie Seymour? And she was 15, 14 when he met, and he was supposedly in a relationship with her mother. Please talk about that.
Nobody really knows. What people do know is that the mother basically handed the 15-year-old Stephanie Seymour off to John Casablancas, wanting her to be a star. There is the story that he had a relationship with the mother, but Paula, if you weren't standing next to the bed holding the towel, you really don't know.
Mm,
So, I don't want to say definitively I know. I know that he had a relationship with Stephanie Seymour because he talked about it. He was in love with her. Um,
right.
but even before Stephanie Seymour, there was another model who I don't remember exactly what I called her in the book because she spoke to me, but she didn't want to be identified. And so I think I called her something like the girl from Kansas. And the girl from Kansas was
Mm,
14 when she started sleeping with him. And John took great exception to the fact that I printed that in the book. And or maybe it was on her 15th birthday or something like that. But John took great
right.
exception that I printed in the book, threatened to sue me, of course, never did.
What?
Because his point was no, 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 she was 16. Now, we don't need to talk about splitting hairs here, but um, the point is she was also in love with John, as was Stephanie Seymour at the time. Jill
Right.
Dodd is a different story. I have no idea what happened with Jill Dodd. He was also sued on several occasions. Nothing ever came of those suits. There was never an adjudication. So again,
Mm,
unfortunately, we can't say we know. Yes, we trust the women involved. Something
mm,
happened. These guys were horny bastards. They were hopping women all the time. So
right.
it wouldn't surprise me.
Well, it's funny because, so for example, Paulina Porizkova, and I notice that you say women because for me, a 14, 15, 16, 17, barely 18-year-old is still a child. Now, just yesterday, Paulina Porizkova came out and talked about her experience in the industry on Instagram. And I need to read what she says because it is pretty powerful. And she says she started modeling at 15 in Paris on a summer break from school and lived in a guest house with the president of the modeling agency, who was a woman. And every day I was sent on 4 to 10 so-called go look-sees, where you go and they look and see. And she said sometimes the people I was seeing were well dressed and in offices, and sometimes they were middle aged guys in messy apartments who just wanted to take a few casual photos of me, preferably topless. I've lost count of the amount of men in open bathrooms or bathrobes who greeted me in their hotel rooms or apartments where I've been sent by an agency or clients. And I've also lost count of the amount of well-dressed older men who invited me to their parties, their cars, their stores, their yachts, their vacation tropical villas. And then she ends her video by saying, if you're unsure of how old exactly a child is to be a child, Well, then you either don't have one or you don't have the humanity to remember being one. And I think she was saying this basically because someone like Megyn Kelly had come out and said, well, a 17-year-old, that's not a child, and I think a lot of these guys seem to just be like, well, they were willing. These guys wanted me. But again, children are pretty
Well,
impressionable.
the age of consent is different in different countries. The
Yes.
70s were a very different time than the 2020s. There were very different moral codes. There were
Mm,
very different ways of behaving. And you need to remember that I don't know at what age exactly Stephanie Seymour defended herself, that Paulina Porizkova defended herself. But one of the things that I love in the book Model is that Paulina used to go to the Bandouche, which was a nightclub, where
hmm
presumably everyone was an adult of drinking age. Can we presume that?
No,
Wearing
we
a
can't
t-shirt,
because you and I have been in plenty of clubs where there are some of age models.
and
Sorry, my
and
eye will tick when
you
I
and
lie
I have
like
been in
that.
plenty of clubs where even if they weren't wearing the t-shirt that
hmm
Paulina wore, they could have, and it said too drunk to fuck.
hmm
So, this is the way that Paulina was behaving as a teenage model in Paris. And that maybe that was a great way to fend off the creepy guys. The funny thing is that I use the word woman, but in the business, whatever age they are, models are known as the girls.
Right.
And the girls, in some cases, in many cases, incorporated the ethic of the time, which was, see that guy over there, go sit in his lap, he'll give you a job. And
Right.
they also, in many cases, were 15 going on 19 or 17 going on 30. And they got thrown in the deep end of a swimming pool and they either learned to swim or they didn't.
Mm.
But there's an interesting, let's go back to Stephanie Seymour and John Casablancas. The
Okay, and then
same
I
year that
do I
Stephanie,
do want to hit on your point how he laid the ground for the really gross guys.
but let's
Someone
so
like
let's go back. But
A Gerald
let's
Marie.
let's talk about the Paulina story. The same summer that Stephanie Seymour came to Paris alone and fell into bed with John Casablancas, Christy Turlington came to Paris
Mm,
with her mother and never got in trouble. So, there's a
right.
role, they say that model agents are in loco parentis, are serving as parents. Well, they're not. They're
Right.
businessmen who look at this as a disposable asset to use up, squeeze dry, and throw away. Now,
Yep.
think about that. That's what models are. They're a disposable asset. They're raw material. Some
Right.
raw material is tough enough to make it through a 20-year career. Some raw material can't make it through the first 5 minutes. And that's part of the dirty business of
Mm.
modeling. Now,
Well, just quickly in that because and when we do talk, and I'm glad you brought up Christy Turlington because that's a very good point about her mother being around because a lot of these girls do not. When I was at page 6, for example, I would see a, a coworker, for example, had a birthday party, and Paolo Zampoli, Donald Trump's friend, who then
co-worker.
ran his own modeling agency, ID Models, said, "I will send a bunch of girls to your party, so it will be a hot party," and he sent 12 girls, all of whom looked under 16, and they had a house mother with them. And my coworker took one look at them and said, "No, you guys got to leave. No, this is wow." And it was saying a lot for my coworker who loved to model. But he literally was so uncomfortable. And then we would see these girls out at like Lotus or, whatever the nightclub was at the time. And they were just sent out and their mothers were nowhere there. It was kind of like, hey, you're 12 and pretty. You want to make some money? It's a little bit like Hollywood.
Well,
Go
you're
make the
exaggerating a
fam.
little. They were probably 14, not 12. But
I met a 12-year-old
you,
year old
I
once.
take your point. Although knowing some of your coworkers, I find the story a little hard to believe.
I was there. I actually
Okay,
saw it. I was there.
that time.
Yes, that time I was there. I saw it, and it made him so uncomfortable. He was like, "You got to get out. This is no, This is creeping me out." And by the way, to creep him out, saying a lot. But so
Now I'm sure I
after,
know who it was.
let's let's keep it to ourselves, shall we? Still a good friend of mine. Um, they so after you had John Casablancas, you had the next wave of guys who doubled down on this their own kind of misogyny and hedonism. Let's talk about them.
Well, basically, the villains of my book are people like Gerald Marie, who followed Casablancas at Elite and took over Elite Paris when John moved to New York to open Elite New York, and a guy named Jean-Luc Brunel, who became a great friend and backer of Jeffrey Epstein and ended up committing suicide in jail after he'd been accused of trafficking women. 30 years before that, in my book, he was accused of drugging and multiply raping girls. So, this is something that was allowed to go on for
Right.
25, 30 years, even after I had exposed it. One of the great stories in my book is the story of the girlfriend who preceded Linda Evangelista in Gerald Marie's bed, and the way that he fed her drugs and kept her under his thumb. These guys were horrible. Claude Haddad was a third one. Haddad and Brunel were both exposed in 1988 on a segment of 60 Minutes that is rarely seen anymore because there was a threat of a lawsuit and CBS suppressed it. History repeating itself. I think that you can find it on YouTube every once in a while. It gets taken down, then it gets put up again. But it had Eileen Ford, the moral paragon of modeling, confronted about Jean-Luc Brunel, with whom she was in business.
Whoa.
And basically having a meltdown on camera over this. And it was the first time, it was Diane Sawyer as the correspondent, and it was the first time that any models dared to say anything. And I think that there were a lot of pressures. Number one, if they wanted to succeed, they knew the score. And you don't talk about it. The only rule of Model Club is you don't talk about Model Club. There's also the fact that, think about it. You're a cashier at Walmart, and a modeling agent, a scout, comes up to you and says, "Hey, baby, you can come to Paris and make a lot of money. And you're the prettiest girl in town. You're the prettiest girl at Walmart. And you go off to Paris and you fail. Who's going to come home and talk about how and why they failed?" Especially at that point. Again, we're talking early 80s. It just wasn't part of the culture. We are looking at it from the perspective of post-Me Too. And even in post-Me Too, some of these situations, like what I said about Mick Jagger, are moral gray zones. The woman who was allegedly raped by Roman Polanski, who was sent to Roman Polanski by her mother, and who doesn't want Roman Polanski vilified anymore. No one listens to her because it's so much more fun to write a headline about the perv Roman Polanski.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. If you're 13, you still can't really consent. You're a child.
She's now a functional adult. And she's the one who said to the prosecutor, stop.
Okay. I hear you.
I'm not saying it's black and white. Well, you're not saying it's black and white either.
Okay. We're going to have to agree to disagree on that one, because as a woman growing up in the 80s, there was a lot. It was crazy. Now, Gerald Marie, he did a lot of bad things. He was the former Elite model management executive. Multiple models, including Carrie Otis, Ebba Thor Johansson, and others accused him of rape and sexual assault spanning decades, which did lead to major investigations in France. But the question that a lot of people want to know, and I've been getting this from all angles, is what the hell happened to Karen Mulder? So most of us remember Karen Mulder as this gorgeous, gorgeous Dutch model. In 2000, she went on French TV, and let me get this exactly so that we don't, she was interviewed on the France 2 show, Tout le monde en parle. And that during the taping, she claimed that various people had raped her, including police officers, politicians, members of her former agency, and allegedly Albert II, Prince of Monaco. She was institutionalized the next year, and it was paid for by Gerald Marie, her alleged abuser and her boss at Elite. What went down there? Do you know?
I don't have a clue. I had seen her maybe 6 months before that television incident, and she seemed perfectly fine.
Right.
There was always the question of whether she was unstable. Then there's the question of, was she clinically unstable? Was she driven to instability? Who knows?
Right.
Is it possible that all of those things happened? Sure.
I mean, it kind of
Is,
fits the
is it
Epstein
sure that
mold.
all of those things happened? No. This is the very first I ever heard about
Right.
Gerald Marie paying for her hospitalization. That
Right.
happened long after I wrote the book, and I wasn't reporting the story anymore.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, it happened in 2001, but you know, it's interesting to me because it does smack of what's been happening with the Epstein. Here's a girl, let me pawn you off to a politician, let me pawn you off to a prince. Here's this.
Interesting that
And
you say 2001. So it happened shortly after Gerald Marie was exposed by the BBC in yet another expose of the modeling industry. And let's say it is true that he paid for her hospitalization. Maybe he thought that it would be a good idea to spend a little money to buy his way back into heaven.
I mean,
Wouldn't put it past him.
or keep her quiet, drug her up more. I just think, here's the deal, Michael. At what point, after all the exposés and after all of this, at what point do people actually stop and say, can we regulate this industry? Is it regulated?
Well, little bits and pieces of it are regulated, but what are you going to do? Send morality police onto every fashion runway, every photo studio, every
No, but you
modeling
could have
agent,
you, but you could.
assign a morality cop to follow every girl? No, what you do is what I tried to do, what 60 Minutes tried to do, what the BBC tried to do, and you try to educate people as to what that world is. And I take it as a compliment that the only reason why my name is in the Epstein files is because J.P. Morgan, when they were doing an investigation of Epstein, stumbled on a copy of my book. And part of the report on Epstein talks about how Michael Gross wrote about Jean-Luc Brunel in this book. And that kind of thing disseminates and it gets around. And
Right.
maybe parents pay a little bit more attention. Maybe preachers pay a little bit more attention. Maybe
I
teachers pay a little bit more attention. Maybe 15-year-old girls now know a lot more than they did 40 years ago. And I'm convinced that that's the case. You've got a skeptical look on your face.
I'm skeptical because why are there not rules that somebody follows a 14 or 15-year-old to a go-see, a look-see, to the modeling casting calls? It is still, I remember 10 years ago looking at some very wealthy banker and he's looking at a modeling lookbook, which is, all the for the people out there, it's the modeling books where they have each girl and their size, their description, all that in their face, and they're dog-earing the pages that they want to the girls that they would be interested in,
Yeah.
and these are just business guys.
Yeah.
So I how is that okay? Or for example, I remember in 2006, I think Stephen Baldwin had a restaurant on 13th and 5th, and I walk in and there was a model wrangler because that's exactly what these jobs are. Nightclub impresarios, also model wranglers. They have to get the models to the table so the rich guys come in and they pay and they all this stuff. And the model wrangler had been contacted by a billionaire who was renting a 10 bedroom house in the Hamptons. And he was at a table, it was a round booth, and there were 8 girls with him, looked very young, very, very young. And he was saying, oh, yeah, well, Bling Blong, we have to leave in a minute when Bling Blong calls because the helicopter is going to be ready and we're all spending the weekend out in the Hamptons with him. And you're like, I don't know if these girls are old enough to drive, much less spend a weekend
Well,
in the
that's why he sent the
Hamptons.
helicopter.
What?
That's why he sent the helicopter.
I know, but much less spend a weekend in the Hamptons with an unknown billionaire and no locks on the door. I mean, at some point, I hear you. You wrote the book. CBS, every other year there's a modeling kind of expose. But at what point do rules kick in saying, hey, we're not going to leave it up to a 14 or 15-year-old girl. We're not going to maybe leave it up to her redneck parents because they don't know shit from Shinola. And they've been told a whole bag of goods. So at what point does the government not say, "Hey, you got to have an adult go into the thing, go into the look-sees with these girls to make sure, stuff's
I,
not going on." Or
I would imagine that after the fashion industry, the advertising industry, the modeling industry all tried to stop that legislation because
right.
it would make the business financially unfeasible. After the models failed to stop that situation because
Mhm.
five spoke up for it and 50 kept their mouths shut because they would prefer to work.
Right.
I would think that after someone spoke up and said, "Oh, really? You're going to pass a law to change human nature?" How many times has that been tried in the thousands of years of human history?
Right.
I think that people knew about Jeffrey Epstein from 2008, and yet he was allowed to continue operating for another 10 years, even after a stint in prison. And the people who were advising him, his pedo whisperers, are still getting profiled in Styles of the Times.
Yep.
um, I would think that you would realize that there's the fantasy of legislation that would stop that, and then
Yep.
there's reality. And so you do what you can. And in my case, what I could do was to try to get the
Yeah.
story out there and educate people. That's as much as I can say. You're not going to pass a law. There's laws against murder. How many bodies have there been in America so far in
Right,
January,
but there's
first week of
also
February?
laws against child working for as a child. I just think it's
There
so
are
frustrating.
international
Like,
laws against war crimes. How many war
right.
crimes have been committed in the last 24 hours?
Do you think the Epstein files will change anything?
Yeah, the political fate of a couple politicians, the career of a couple lawyers, and then again, there are the pedo whisperers who are
Mhm.
still, out there functioning fully. I got a email today from one of the pedo whisperers who just got a new job and was asking me for my email address so that I could be sure that I was invited to the parties. And there's no shame. And
What do you mean by pedo whisperer? I need to let's what exactly
the people who
just
were advising Jeffrey Epstein on his image. You know who they are
right.
as well as I do.
Right. Got it. I love everyone, and it's almost like I see this stuff online and people are saying, "Oh no, this is it. This is a watershed moment." I mean, they said that about me too. This stuff is still going on. Harvey went down. Okay. A
And I'm
couple
sure
other
there are
guys.
people. I'm sure there are people who said to Johnny Casablancas, "Hey, Johnny, maybe you should put it back in your pants half the time. You wouldn't get into twice as much trouble." So
Yeah. You're not kidding. I mean, what
John
it's just
Luc
so
Brunel, John Luc Brunel had enough of a sense of shame about what he was already known for
mm,
that when I interviewed him, he made a point of telling me how he had stopped taking cocaine. And
really stop taking
then
cocaine.
stopped taking cocaine. And later that night,
Good for
when one of the 16-year-old models who was living in his apartment, where there was a peephole in the bathroom where he would watch them taking a shower, he
Oh,
found out I was in his apartment, and zip, 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 the Ferrari pulls up in front of the apartment building on Avenue Foch, and there's John Le Brunel. And funny thing, it's about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, Brunel couldn't stop sniffling,
I'm
but
sure it was the air conditioning.
he didn't take cocaine.
Yeah, no. I mean, jeez. I feel like I need a Silkwood shower right now. I love talking to you, but just discussing this subject
Hey, this was
makes me
your
want
idea.
to. It was, but it was because I don't think people understand that this goes on. It's gone on forever and it keeps going on.
But let's at various points in the modeling industry, let's narrow it down again.
Okay.
There have been moments of backlash. And there was a moment of backlash in the mid 90s when agencies run by women became a very fashionable thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of those women had cocaine problems. Maybe they weren't paying as much attention as they needed
Right.
to. And then there
Well,
were the glamorous guys who were saying, you come with me, you could do a lot better. And so things still went on, and the women run agency thing passed.
also
After
you
Me
had
Too,
people like Faith Cates who ran Next Model Management and was hanging out with Epstein.
and always denied knowing anything about him. Well, but at the moment, things have changed a great deal. The
Mm-hmm.
industry has attempted to say you can't be on a runway if you're
Right.
under a certain age. You can't do this if you're under a certain age. There are
Right.
there are now guards backstage at fashion shows, whereas when I was covering fashion, any guy could run around the backstage of a fashion show while 20 of the hottest women in the face of the earth were changing their clothes.
Yeah,
Um,
I
um,
please. That happened in in the 2000s as well. I think I was at the Alice and Olivia. Stacey Bendit wanted me to she was like, "Come walk on my show." So I was like, "Okay." But it was not just her show. There were a bunch of other things going on, and there were a lot of models changing. I'm from Ohio and Kentucky. I was like, hiding everything, and of course they're like, "Whatever, this is our job."
yeah,
And there were men walking
yep.
backstage and doing it still,
And some
even
of
in
them
the
were probably
2000s.
shopping.
Thank you. Exactly.
But I always remember one of the most famous fashion editors of all time, Polly Mellon, who
Hmm.
worked for Diana Vreeland, worked for um, Grace Mirabella, worked for Anna Winter,
Right.
once said to me about a shoot with the model Gia Karanji,
Hmm.
where she had just shot up before she went on the set and blood was dripping down her arm. And the question was asked, why didn't you stop the shoot? And she said, all that matters is whether you get the picture.
Wow.
And Polly was in certain ways a kind of prototypical feminist. She
Yep.
worked until she was in her 80s. She was a very strong, indomitable woman, and yet what she had learned from the fashion system was it doesn't matter.
Right.
The only thing that matters is get the picture.
Well, and also the only thing that matters is your bottom line, and the shoots already cost 75 grand. So get the picture. It is kind of a statement on our society that basic children can be commodified, and really it's all about the buck at the end of the day, the buck or the pervert.
But the bottom line is that is still considered beyond the pale, and there will always be people who will look askance at that, and there will always be a tug in the
Hmm.
opposite direction. And it won't always be Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tom Tillis tugging the rope. There are lots of
Right.
and remember also that in this particular instance, you're dealing with the political push-pull of to whose advantage does the Epstein matter play. You see that in that idiot congressional committee that wants to hold the Clintons in contempt, but won't interview a single Republican or Trump cabinet
Right.
person who's named in the Epstein funds. There's politics involved here. Morality is a very
Hmm.
stretchy concept.
Yeah, you're right. And especially when, pretty women or pretty children are involved.
And I actually want to drag you back to where we started
Okay.
because when Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump were running around New York as young bachelors, they were watching John Casablancas and they were going to the parties that John Casablancas was throwing at the Plaza Hotel in the early 90s. And they were
Wow.
judging the Look of the Year contest where 13 and 14-year-old girls were paraded in front of middle-aged men for their approval. And they were watching and they were thinking, maybe I should open a modeling agency. And they were no different from that guy, Harry Conover, in the 1930s, who said to
Well,
himself, I'm going to open me up a date farm. And, we don't know what Trump Models was up to. We don't, we have a better idea what Jeffrey
hmm.
Epstein was up to when he bankrolled MC2 for Jean-Luc Brunel, that wonderful character. But, this has gone on from time immemorial.
Wow.
And only when society changes in a fundamental way will it stop. And I
Hmm.
think you see society changing incrementally, tiny little steps,
Right.
almost indiscernibly, but it changes. And that's,
Y-
if there's any good news here, Paula, that's it. It changes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm still disheartened by the fact that you and I both know any rich man could start a modeling agency or a magazine, wink, and, see what they could get away with. But thank you. I appreciate that. And Now we're coming to the end, and I just want to remind everyone, like, subscribe, and also Michael has an amazing new book coming out in June this year, and it's called Treasured Island, and it is about St. Bart's. So,
Here's the cover.
look at that gorgeousness. Wow. And it's about the history of St. Bart's and all the shenanigans and all the weird, bad, awesome behavior that went on, and all the yachts.
And
Of
models
course.
and designers and modeling agents and even Jeffrey Epstein get name checked.
Yep, there you go. Oh, and all the times that Ghislaine Maxwell flew her helicopter back and forth to take all the people. I used to hear that all the time. Anyone who's been to St. Bart's has most likely been to Pedo Island, because she would fly them back and forth on the helicopter.
I was never invited. Should I feel bad?
Yes, yes, you should feel horrible, and
I feel so fortunate.
tell your wife that you're done.
She's
Anyway,
right there
thank you.
listening. She's right over there.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much, Michael. I really, really appreciate it. And
Always a
to
pleasure.
everyone, just let me know what you think.
Welcome
Talk
back to New
soon.
York. Glad you're here.